What if I told you that the United States government once deliberately poisoned its own citizens to discourage drinking? That for 7 years, you could legally mail your children through the postal service like packages? That pinball machines were banned as dangerous gambling devices, raided by police with sledgehammers? These aren't conspiracy theories or urban legends. These are real federal policies that shaped American life, sometimes for decades, sometimes for a century or more. From cheese stored in Missouri caves to eagle feathers as federal contraband, from banned yellow margarine to regulated peanut butter percentages, the rules our government created reveal something fascinating about how we've tried to control, protect, and occasionally confuse ourselves. So, before we dive into these 50 strange but true stories, hit that subscribe button because you're about to discover that reality is far weirder than fiction. Now, let's start with something cheerful. Government-sanctioned poisoning. Poisoned alcohol during Prohibition. Let's start with something cheerful. The time the United States government decided to poison its own citizens. You're going to sleep great after this one. It's the 1920s. Prohibition is in full swing, which means alcohol is illegal. And naturally, everyone wants it more than ever. This is how humans work. Tell us we can't have something, and suddenly, it's the only thing we can think about. The government knew people were drinking industrial alcohol, the kind meant for manufacturing, and redistilling it into something drinkable. And the government had a thought: what if we made that deadly? So they did. They added toxic chemicals to industrial alcohol. Methanol, benzene, things that would make you violently ill or, kill you. And then they sat back and watched as people died. Over 10,000 people. By most estimates, 10,000 deaths to discourage drinking. Let that number sit with you for a moment while you adjust your pillow. Officials called this discouraging consumption, which is perhaps the most chilling euphemism in American regulatory history. Like calling a house fire aggressive climate control. The policy continued throughout Prohibition, even as the bodies piled up, even as doctors pleaded for it to stop. The logic was simple and horrifying. If people knew the alcohol might kill them, they'd stop drinking it. They did not stop drinking it, and somewhere in all of this, someone in Washington thought this was working as intended. Ban on mailing children. Of course, when you're thinking about government overreach and questionable decisions, your mind naturally drifts to the Postal Service. Specifically, that time when Americans could mail their children through the United States Postal Service. Because that happened. That was a real thing people did. Between 1913 and 1920, parents discovered a loophole in postal regulations that would make modern helicopter parents faint. The parcel post service had just been introduced, and it was cheaper than train tickets. Much cheaper. So families, particularly those in rural areas, would quite literally mail their children to relatives or destinations using the postal service. The kids would be classified as parcels, stamped with the appropriate postage based on their weight, and handed over to a mail carrier who would deliver them, safe and sound, to grandma's house or wherever they were going. The heaviest child on record was 48.5 pounds. I want you to imagine being the postal worker who had to weigh a toddler like a package of flour and calculate shipping costs. These children, we should note, weren't stuffed in boxes or anything quite that absurd. They traveled in the passenger areas of mail trains, accompanied by postal workers. It was technically safe. It was also deeply, profoundly weird. Eventually, the Postal Service caught on that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't what parcel post was designed for, and they quietly added regulations prohibiting the mailing of human beings. But, for a brief, strange window in American history, you could mail your kid across state lines for about 15 cents. Margarine color ban. Now, let's talk about butter. Or rather, let's talk about what happens when you threaten butter's dominance in the American marketplace. Because in America, we take our dairy lobbies seriously. Starting in the 1880s and continuing well into the 1960s, the federal government, under pressure from dairy farmers, decided that margarine was a threat that needed to be contained. Not banned outright, mind you. Yellow margarine, the kind that looked appetizing and butter-like, was taxed heavily. The solution? Margarine was sold white, the color of lard, with a separate packet of yellow dye that you could mix in at home if you wanted your spread to look remotely appealing. Imagine buying food that comes with a craft project, like buying gray ketchup with red food coloring sold separately. Wisconsin, America's dairyland, held out the longest, enforcing their margarine color ban until 1967. 1967, the summer of love. Woodstock was 2 years away. We'd been to space, and Wisconsin was still making people buy white margarine. The dairy lobby argued this was about protecting consumers from being deceived. Really, it was about protecting butter sales from a cheaper alternative. It was economic protectionism dressed up as consumer safety, and it worked for decades. Eventually, the bans faded, yellow margarine became legal everywhere, and the great butter margarine wars cooled into the cold indifference of modern supermarket dairy aisles. No pinball in cities. Here's a sentence I bet you never expected to hear. Pinball machines were once considered dangerous gambling devices that corrupted youth and were banned in major American cities for decades. Yes, pinball, the same game you play at pizza restaurants while waiting for your order. Starting in the 1940s and lasting in some places until the 1970s, cities like New York classified pinball as gambling. The reasoning was that the games were based primarily on luck, not skill, and therefore fell under gambling laws. Police would actually raid arcades, smashing pinball machines with sledgehammers like they were busting up speakeasies. There's something darkly hilarious about imagining police officers dramatically destroying pinball machines while actual crime was presumably happening elsewhere. New York's ban lasted until 1976, when it was finally overturned. How? A pinball wizard named Roger Sharp demonstrated to the New York City Council that the game required genuine skill. He called his shots, proved he could control the ball's movement, and convinced the legislators that this wasn't just gambling. It was like a courtroom scene from a legal drama, except instead of a murder trial, everyone was very serious about pinball. The ban was lifted. Arcades flourished. A generation of kids grew up able to legally play pinball without their parents worrying about police raids. But somewhere in storage, probably, there's still a sledgehammer with pinball enforcement written on it. Onion futures trading ban. Let's pivot to something that sounds boring but is actually delightfully weird. Onions. Specifically, the fact that onions are the only commodity in the United States that you cannot trade futures on. Not oil, not gold, not soybeans. This law has been on the books since 1958, and it's still in effect today. It came about because two traders, Vincent Kosuga and Sam Siegel, decided to corner the onion market. They bought enormous quantities of onion futures, manipulated the price, made millions, and in the process destroyed onion farmers across the country. Prices crashed. Farmers were left selling onions for less than the cost of the bags they came in. So they passed the Onion Futures Act, a law specifically about onions. No other vegetable has been singled out like this. You can trade futures on corn, wheat, soybeans, even orange juice, but onions? Absolutely not. Too dangerous, too volatile, too oniony. There's something beautifully American about this. A problem emerges, causes chaos for a brief period, and instead of addressing the broader structural issues with futures trading or market manipulation, Congress just bans the specific thing that caused the immediate problem. It's regulatory whack-a-mole. And now, nearly 70 years later, onion futures remain prohibited. If you've ever wondered why onions seem reasonably priced at the grocery store, it's because no one can gamble on them anymore. Sleep well, knowing your French onion soup is protected by federal law. Refrigerator door latch ban. Sometimes, a law exists because something terrible happened, and society collectively decided it should never happen again. This is one of those times, and it's going to be a little dark, so fair warning before you drift off. Before 1956, refrigerators had latching doors, heavy, inward-locking mechanisms that sealed tight to keep the cold in. which sounds fine until you realize what happened when curious children climbed inside while playing hide and seek. The doors would lock behind them. They couldn't get out. They suffocated. This happened enough times that Congress finally acted. The Refrigerator Safety Act of 1956 mandated magnetic doors that could be pushed open from the inside. Overnight, the old latch-style refrigerators became illegal. Manufacturers had to redesign. Families had to replace their appliances, or at least update them with new doors. It worked. Deaths dropped dramatically. Today, you probably don't think twice about opening your refrigerator door, about how easily it swings open, how little force it takes. That's by design. That's because of a law passed nearly 70 years ago in response to preventable tragedy. So there's your bedtime thought. Every time you open your fridge for a midnight snack, you're benefiting from safety regulations written because too many children died in what should have been safe household appliances. Sweet dreams. The next topic is about mail-order contraception being illegal. Postal ban on obscene items. In 1873, a man named Anthony Comstock convinced Congress that the United States Postal Service was being used to distribute materials that would corrupt the moral fiber of America. What kind of materials? Contraceptives, information about birth control, medical textbooks with anatomical drawings, basically anything related to human reproduction that wasn't strictly about making more humans. The Comstock Law, as it became known, made it illegal to send obscene, lewd, or lascivious materials through the mail. The definition of obscene was left wonderfully vague, which meant Anthony Comstock himself, as a postal inspector, got to decide what counted. Anatomy textbooks for medical students? Obscene. Information about preventing pregnancy? Basically pornography. According to the law, this wasn't just theoretical. People were arrested. Doctors were prosecuted for mailing birth control information to patients. Margaret Sanger, who would later found Planned Parenthood, was indicted under the Comstock Law. The law remained on the books and was actively enforced until the 1960s and 70s, when various court cases finally chipped away at it. Think about that timeline. We went to the moon before we decided that mailing birth control information wasn't obscene. We split the atom and built nuclear weapons while doctors could still be arrested for sending contraceptive advice through the mail. The Comstock Law is technically still partially on the books, though it's no longer enforced in any meaningful way. But for nearly a century, American mail carriers were unwitting enforcers of Victorian-era sexual morality. Foreign language school bans. World War I ended in 1918, but the suspicion and hostility toward anything German-related lingered like a bad hangover that lasted years. Several states, caught up in patriotic fervor and anti-German sentiment, decided that the solution to ensuring American loyalty was to ban the teaching of foreign languages in schools, particularly German. In 1919, multiple states passed laws prohibiting instruction in languages other than English in elementary schools. The reasoning was that teaching children foreign languages would somehow make them less American, less loyal, more susceptible to foreign influence, because nothing says freedom quite like banning education. A teacher named Robert Meyer in Nebraska was arrested and convicted for the crime of reading Bible stories to a child in German. Just to be clear, a teacher was criminally prosecuted for teaching religion in the language the student's family spoke at home. He was fined $25, which doesn't sound like much until you remember that $25 in 1920 was several weeks' wages. The case went to the Supreme Court, which in 1923 finally ruled in Meyer v. Nebraska that these laws were unconstitutional. Teaching foreign languages is protected. You can't ban education just because you're scared of the language. But for several years there, speaking German in school could get you arrested, which really makes you appreciate how quickly fear can turn into policy and how long it takes for reason to catch up. Federal duck stamp for hunters. Let's lighten things up with ducks. Specifically, with the fact that if you want to hunt waterfowl in the United States, you need to buy a duck stamp, not a regular hunting license, a special stamp with a picture of a duck on it. This started in 1934 during the Great Depression, when wetlands were disappearing and duck populations were declining. The government needed money to buy and preserve wetlands, so they created the federal duck stamp program. Every hunter had to buy one. The money went directly to conservation. But here's where it gets charming. There's an annual duck stamp art contest. Artists submit paintings of waterfowl, and the winner's artwork becomes that year's stamp. It's like the Olympics, except for people who are really good at painting ducks. Winning is prestigious in wildlife art circles. The stamps themselves have become collectible. So you have this weird intersection of bureaucracy, conservation, art, and hunting culture, all centered around stamps that you have to buy to shoot ducks. And it works. The program has conserved millions of acres of wetlands. The ducks are doing fine. Artists have successful careers painting waterfowl in exquisite detail. Sometimes government programs work exactly as intended, preserve the environment, support the arts, and make hunters happy all at once. If you're falling asleep right now thinking about duck stamps, that's perfectly fine. That's what we're here for. Gold ownership ban. Imagine waking up one day and being told that the gold you own, whether it's coins, bars, or jewelry, has to be turned over to the government. Not because you did anything wrong, but because the president signed an order saying, private gold ownership is now illegal. Welcome to 1933. During the Great Depression, President Franklin Roosevelt issued Executive Order 6102, which required American citizens to surrender their gold to the Federal Reserve. The government paid $35 per ounce, then immediately revalued gold to $35 per ounce for international trade, effectively devaluing everyone's holdings. Hoarding gold became a felony punishable by 10 years in prison or a $10,000 fine. There were exceptions. Rare coins for collectors were allowed, which created this bizarre situation where numismatic value determined legality. Gold jewelry was permitted. But gold bars? Gold certificates? Hand them over. The government needed gold reserves to stabilize the currency, and individual rights to property came second. This wasn't a temporary wartime measure. The ban lasted until 1975. For 42 years, Americans couldn't own gold bullion. Richard Nixon was president when it finally ended. We'd been through World War II, the Korean War, Vietnam, the Civil Rights Movement, and Woodstock, all while private gold ownership was illegal. The government collected about 300 tons of gold from citizens. Whether this helped end the Depression is debatable, but it definitely happened, and it definitely seems like the kind of thing that would cause a stir if proposed today. No lottery tickets. By mail. Speaking of things the government decided you can't have, that's when Congress decided that the mail system shouldn't be used for gambling and passed laws prohibiting the interstate mailing of lottery tickets, advertisements for lotteries, or really anything lottery-related. This law is still on the books today, still active, still enforced, which creates some fascinating complications in our modern era of multi-state lotteries like Powerball and Mega Millions. You can buy a ticket in person at your local gas station, absolutely no problem. But if you win, and the Lottery Commission wants to mail your winnings to you across state lines, that's technically illegal under federal law. They have to find workarounds, like requiring you to pick up your prize in person or using private courier services instead of the postal system. The original law was passed during a period of moral panic about Louisiana's lottery, which had become notorious for corruption and fraud. Congress wanted to shut it down, and since they couldn't directly regulate state lotteries, they went after the mail system instead. Cut off the lottery's ability to sell tickets nationwide, and you've effectively killed it. It worked. The Louisiana lottery collapsed. But the law remained, even as state-run lotteries became respectable revenue sources for education and infrastructure. Even as Americans collectively decided that maybe gambling isn't inherently evil. So now we have this bizarre situation where states operate massive lottery systems, generate billions in revenue, advertise constantly on television and billboards, but cannot use the United States Postal Service to conduct business across state lines. They work around it. Everyone pretends the law doesn't exist, but technically, mailing lottery materials is still a federal crime. It's the kind of outdated regulation that stays on the books because removing it would require Congress to care enough to act, and there are so many more important things to worry about. So, the law sits there, mostly ignored, occasionally relevant, a remnant of when America thought it could legislate morality through postal regulations. Federal Helium Reserve. Now let's talk about helium, which is not just for party balloons and making your voice sound funny, although those are delightful uses. Helium is actually a strategic resource, essential for things like MRI machines, rocket fuel, and various scientific applications. And for most of the 20th century, the United States government maintained a massive helium reserve inside limestone caves near Amarillo, Texas, because apparently that's where you keep helium. This started in 1925 with the Helium Control Act, passed because the military needed helium for blimps and airships. Remember, this was the era when people thought dirigibles were the future of transportation, right up until the Hindenburg caught fire and everyone collectively reconsidered. But helium doesn't burn, which made it valuable for military aircraft, so the government began stockpiling it. The National Helium Reserve, as it became officially known, stored billions of cubic feet of helium in underground caverns. Your tax dollars, literally sitting in a cave in Texas, waiting for a helium emergency. And for decades, this made sense. The military needed it. Scientific research needed it. The government controlled most of the world's helium supply. Then, the Cold War ended. Blimps stopped being militarily relevant. The reserve became less strategic and more of a budget line item that nobody could quite justify. In 1996, Congress passed a law requiring the reserve to be sold off. The goal was to pay back the debt the reserve had accumulated and get the government out of the helium business. The sell-off created its own problems. By flooding the market with cheap helium, it discouraged private production. When supplies started running low in the 2000s, there was a genuine helium shortage. Suddenly, party supply stores couldn't get enough helium for balloons. Hospitals worried about MRI machines. Scientists panicked about research equipment. The irony is beautiful. The government created a strategic reserve, maintained it for decades, then dismantled it so efficiently that it created the exact shortage the reserve was meant to prevent. The reserve officially closed in 2013, though some helium storage continues for federal use. So, next time you see a balloon, appreciate its journey from Texas limestone caves. Absinthe import ban. Let's drift over to Absinthe, the green fairy, La Fée Verte. The drink that supposedly made artists hallucinate and drove people mad. Or rather, let's talk about how America banned it for 95 years based on what turned out to be mostly folklore and moral panic. In 1912, the United States prohibited the importation and sale of absinthe. The reasoning was that the drink contained thujone, a chemical compound found in wormwood, one of absinthe's botanical ingredients. Thujone was believed to cause hallucinations, seizures, and various forms of madness. Vincent van Gogh drank absinthe. Oscar Wilde wrote about it. Clearly, this was dangerous stuff that turned people into degenerate artists. The ban lasted until 2007. 2007. We're talking about a prohibition that outlasted the actual prohibition. For nearly a century, absinthe was contraband, smuggled in bottles, romanticized in literature, forbidden to American drinkers who could only dream of the green fairy's supposed mind-altering properties. Then scientists actually studied thujone in the amounts present in absinthe and discovered something hilarious. It doesn't do anything. The thujone content in absinthe is far too low to cause hallucinations or any psychoactive effects beyond regular alcohol intoxication. The stories of absinthe-induced madness were either the result of people drinking incredibly high-proof alcohol, or the fact that absinthe in the 19th century was sometimes contaminated with actual toxic chemicals because regulations weren't great. When the ban was lifted in 2007, it wasn't because the government changed its mind about thujone being dangerous. It was because they realized it was never dangerous to begin with. All those years of prohibition were based on a misunderstanding of chemistry and a lot of cultural anxiety about bohemian artists. Now you can buy absinthe in liquor stores across America. It tastes like licorice. It turns cloudy when you add water. It doesn't make you hallucinate. Ter, to, in this flesh. The Green Fairy was just regular alcohol, with good marketing and bad science behind its prohibition. Sometimes the strangest laws are the ones based on myths that everyone believed were facts. No presidential likeness on ads. Here's a weird one that makes sense once you think about it. Companies cannot use images of presidents in commercial advertising without permission, and they definitely can't use them while the president is still alive and in office. This isn't just custom or politeness. It's federal protection that's been around since the early 1900s. The law emerged from a practical concern. Companies were using images of presidents to endorse products the presidents had never actually endorsed. It was an early version of unauthorized celebrity endorsements, except instead of celebrities, it was the leader of the free world apparently recommending your cigarettes or breakfast cereal. The most famous example involved Franklin Roosevelt. After he became president in 1933, his image appeared in advertisements for all sorts of products, including cigarettes. FDR didn't smoke the brand being advertised, had never endorsed them. But there he was, presidential and dignified, apparently suggesting you smoke Lucky Strikes or whatever brand had most aggressively stolen his likeness. The government cracked down. Companies were forced to pull advertisements. Legal frameworks were established to protect presidential images from commercial exploitation. The reasoning was partly about dignity of the office, partly about preventing consumer deception, and partly about making sure the president couldn't be inadvertently associated with products or companies that might be controversial. This protection extends beyond just advertising. You can't use a president's image on products without permission. You can use it for news, commentary, education, or political speech, but not to sell things, which is why you don't see current presidents' faces on merchandise in stores unless it's political campaign material or obvious parody protected by the First Amendment. It's a strange little corner of American law that most people never think about until they wonder why their favorite brand isn't using the president's image in their Super Bowl commercial. The answer is because it's illegal and has been for over a century, and probably should stay that way. After all, the presidency has enough problems without also having to worry about being a billboard. Do not call registry exemptions. In 2003, the Federal Trade Commission created the National Do Not Call Registry, and Americans rejoiced. Finally, a way to stop the endless parade of telemarketers calling during dinner to sell timeshares, extended car warranties, and questionable investment opportunities. You could add your number to a list, and telemarketers were legally required to stop calling you. It was beautiful. It was simple. It worked, except for the exemptions. Because of course there are exemptions. Political organizations can still call you, charities can still call you, companies you've done business with recently can still call you, survey organizations can still call you. So the Do Not Call registry stops some telemarketing, but not the most annoying kinds. The kinds backed by money, power, and the First Amendment. The political exemption is particularly notable because it means that during election season, your phone will still ring constantly with robocalls, campaign messages, and requests for donations. The politicians who created the Do Not Call registry carved out an exception for themselves. It's like passing a noise ordinance that applies to everyone except your own garage band. The reasoning, legally speaking, is that political speech is protected by the First Amendment and deserves special consideration, which is fine in theory. In practice, it means that the period when you most want your phone to stop ringing with recorded messages is exactly when the law doesn't protect you. Charities got their exemption for similar reasons. Calling to request donations is considered a form of expression that shouldn't be restricted. Never mind that many charities are actually fundraising organizations that keep 90% of what they collect and only send a tiny fraction to the actual cause. So the Do Not Call registry exists. It helps. But it's got more holes than Swiss cheese, and all the holes seem to benefit the exact groups most likely to call you repeatedly. Politicians asking for votes, and charities asking for money. At least the extended car warranty people mostly stopped. That's something. That's a win. We can sleep soundly, knowing we achieved. Commercial space burial permits. Let's float up to space for a moment. Because in the 1990s, the Federal Aviation Administration had to start dealing with a question nobody had really considered before. What do you do when people want to launch cremated remains into orbit? Commercial space burial became a thing when companies started offering services to launch small portions of cremated remains on rockets heading to space. Gene Roddenberry, creator of Star Trek, had some of his ashes launched into orbit in 1997. It's a beautiful thought. The man who created a future of space exploration, getting to participate in it, literally, even after death. But this created regulatory questions. Who oversees space burials? What are the safety concerns? What happens if the rocket explodes on launch and you've got cremated remains scattered across the launch site? The FAA, which regulates commercial spaceflight, stepped in and said, "You need permits for this." The regulations are actually pretty reasonable. The cremated remains have to be properly contained. They can't pose a risk to the spacecraft or other payloads. The family has to consent to the specific burial method. If the remains are going into orbit, they have to be in a container that will eventually re-enter the atmosphere and burn up, because we're not going to create eternal space debris out of someone's ashes. There's something wonderfully human about this. We went from humans can't leave the planet to we need regulations for space funerals in less than 50 years. We created a bureaucratic process for launching people's remains into the cosmos. There are forms to fill out, permits to obtain, safety protocols. The ashes that make it to space eventually burn up on re-entry, becoming shooting stars, which is perhaps the most poetic end anyone could ask for. From stardust we came, to stardust we return, after obtaining the proper FAA permits and filling out the necessary paperwork. Even in death and space, bureaucracy finds a way. Here's one that affects real people in frustrating ways. It's illegal to buy prescription medications abroad, even medications manufactured in the United States, and bring them back into the country through the mail. This matters because those same medications are often significantly cheaper in Canada, Mexico, and other countries than they are in American pharmacies. The ban on drug re-importation has been in place since the 1980s, though various versions existed before that. The official reasoning is safety. The government can't verify that medications purchased abroad are genuine, properly stored, or not counterfeit. Which sounds reasonable until you realize we're often talking about the exact same pills, made by the same companies, in the same factories, just sold for less in other countries. This has led to a uniquely American phenomenon. Bus trips to Canada for prescription drugs. Senior citizens, particularly those on fixed incomes, will literally board buses and travel across the border to buy insulin, blood pressure medication, and other prescriptions for a fraction of what they'd pay at home. It's cheaper to spend a day on a bus to Canada than to buy a month's supply of medication at the local CVS. Various attempts have been made to legalize re-importation or create pathways for Americans to safely access cheaper medications from abroad. These attempts have consistently failed, usually after pharmaceutical companies lobby heavily against them. The industry argues about safety and intellectual property. Critics point out that it's really about profit margins and market control. So the law remains. You cannot legally mail prescription drugs to yourself from Canada, even if they're identical to the FDA-approved medications sold in America, even if they cost 70% less, even if you desperately need them and can't afford the American prices. The government maintains this is about protecting you. Whether you feel protected or just frustrated probably depends on whether you've ever had to choose between medication and groceries. But either way, the ban stands, seniors keep boarding buses to Canada, and everyone pretends this is a sustainable system. Federal cheese surplus caves. Sometimes a government program becomes so perfectly absurd that it crosses into the realm of legend. Let me tell you about the time America stored over 1 billion pounds of cheese in caves in Missouri. This actually happened. This was official policy. It started in the 1970s with farm subsidies. The government wanted to support dairy farmers, so they offered to buy surplus milk, cheese, and butter at guaranteed prices. Great for farmers. terrible for storage. Because if you promise to buy unlimited dairy products, you end up with more dairy products than you know what to do with. So the government bought cheese, mountains of it, enormous quantities that nobody wanted to buy at market prices because the government had artificially inflated prices by buying up the surplus. And you can't just let cheese sit around. It needs to be stored somewhere cool, dry, and secure. Somewhere like the limestone caves outside Springfield, Missouri. These weren't small caves. The government ended up storing hundreds of millions of pounds of cheese in climate-controlled cave systems. Cheddar, Swiss, processed cheese products. By the early 1980s, the stockpile had grown to over 1 billion pounds. 1 billion pounds of cheese. In 1981, President Ronald Reagan decided to start distributing the surplus. The government began giving away cheese to food banks, welfare programs, and anyone who qualified for food assistance. This became known as government cheese, and it developed a reputation, not necessarily a good reputation. It was edible, nutritious, and free, but it wasn't winning any awards for flavor or quality. The cheese caves became a symbol of government inefficiency, bureaucratic overreach meeting the law of unintended consequences, resulting in enough cheese to supply every American with several pounds. The surplus eventually diminished, but the caves are still used for commercial cheese storage today. So if you ever doubted that government policy can have strange consequences, remember, cheese caves. We had cheese caves. We might still have them, just not government-owned anymore. Filled milk ban. Let's stay in the dairy section for a moment and talk about a law so specific and so weird that most people don't even know it exists. The filled milk ban. Still on the books. Still technically enforced. Still protecting you from the grave danger of evaporated milk mixed with vegetable oil. The Filled Milk Act of 1923 declared that evaporated milk, to which any fat or oil other than milk fat has been added, is adulterated and cannot be shipped in interstate commerce. The reasoning at the time was consumer protection mixed with dairy industry lobbying. Real milk has milk fat. If you're selling something called milk that has vegetable oil instead, you're misleading consumers and threatening legitimate dairy producers. On the surface, this sounds reasonable. But the law was so broad and so harshly worded that it effectively banned an entire category of products that might have been useful for people who couldn't afford or couldn't digest regular milk. Filled milk was cheaper. For families struggling during the Depression, it was an affordable alternative. The law eliminated that option to protect dairy farmers' market share. The Supreme Court upheld the law in 1923, saying Congress has the power to regulate commerce and protect public health. Various legal challenges over the years have failed. The law remains. In practical terms, the Filled Milk Act doesn't affect much anymore. We have all sorts of milk alternatives now. Soy milk, almond milk, oat milk, none of which are technically milk under the law's definition, so they escape its restrictions. But back when it passed, it was a significant example of the government picking winners and losers in the marketplace, wrapping economic protectionism in the language of public health. It's dairy lobby success story that's lasted a century, protecting an industry by outlawing competition and calling it consumer safety. And somewhere in the federal code, gathering dust, that law still sits, ready to strike down any evaporated milk that dares to contain vegetable oil. No teaching evolution in schools. Let's talk about evolution, education, and the time multiple American states decided that teaching Darwin's theory was illegal. This isn't ancient history. These laws lasted well into the 1960s, and the cultural battles they represent are still being fought in different forms today. Starting in the 1920s, several states passed laws prohibiting the teaching of evolution in public schools. The most famous was Tennessee's Butler Act, passed in 1925, which made it illegal to teach any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible. The penalty was a fine of $100 to $500, which was substantial money at the time. This led directly to the Scopes trial. One of the most famous court cases in American history. John Scopes, a high school teacher, deliberately taught evolution to challenge the law. He was found guilty and fined $100. The trial became a national spectacle, a clash between religious fundamentalism and scientific education, between William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow, between tradition and modernity. Scopes lost. The law stood, and for decades afterward, teachers in multiple states had to avoid teaching one of the fundamental theories of modern biology because it contradicted a literal interpretation of Genesis. Textbooks were censored. Science curriculum was watered down. Students graduated without understanding one of the most important scientific frameworks for understanding life on Earth. It wasn't until 1968 that the Supreme Court finally struck down these laws in Epperson v. Arkansas. The court ruled that banning evolution teaching violated the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. You can't prohibit scientific education just because it conflicts with religious doctrine. But the victory was complicated. States responded by passing laws requiring equal time for creationism alongside evolution, or by discouraging evolution teaching through other means. The legal battle ended. The cultural battle continues. For over 40 years, though, multiple states officially prohibited teaching evolution. And students learned biology without the unifying theory that makes sense of it all, because legislators decided religious sensibilities were more important than scientific education. Federal War on Marijuana Classification. Speaking of ongoing cultural battles that started decades ago and never quite resolved, let's talk about marijuana and how it became a Schedule I controlled substance, a classification it maintains to this day despite significant changes in public opinion and state laws. In 1970, Congress passed the Controlled Substances Act, which created a scheduling system for drugs based on their medical value and potential for abuse. Schedule I was reserved for the most dangerous substances, drugs with high potential for abuse, no accepted medical use, and no safe level of use, even under medical supervision. This is where marijuana was placed, alongside heroin and LSD. Here's where it gets interesting. President Richard Nixon appointed a commission, the Schaefer Commission, to study marijuana and make recommendations. In 1972, the commission released its report recommending that marijuana be decriminalized for personal use. Nixon ignored the recommendation completely. The drug stayed Schedule I. This classification means that, according to federal law, marijuana is more dangerous than cocaine, which is Schedule II, more dangerous than methamphetamine, also Schedule II. Both cocaine and meth have recognized medical uses and are therefore considered less problematic than marijuana, which is apparently so dangerous it has no medical value whatsoever. Except states disagreed. Starting with California in 1996, states began legalizing medical marijuana, then recreational marijuana. As of now, dozens of states have some form of legal marijuana, and the federal government mostly looks the other way, creating this bizarre legal limbo where something can be completely legal under state law and completely illegal under federal law simultaneously. Banks won't serve marijuana businesses because marijuana money is technically drug money under federal law. Researchers struggle to study marijuana's medical benefits because Schedule I substances require special permissions and oversight. Doctors in legal states can recommend marijuana but can't prescribe it because prescribing a Schedule I substance would cost them their medical license. The disconnect between federal classification and reality has been obvious for years. Multiple organizations, including the American Medical Association, have called for rescheduling. States keep legalizing. The federal government keeps maintaining that marijuana is a dangerous drug with no medical value. It's a perfect example of policy inertia. A decision made over 50 years ago, based on politics rather than science, that continues to shape law and lives despite overwhelming evidence that the original classification was wrong. But changing it would require admitting that, and governments are notoriously bad at that particular skill. No, selling skim milk as milk. Now, let's venture into the wonderfully petty world of dairy regulation disputes, specifically the question of what exactly constitutes milk and whether skim milk deserves to be called milk at all. Yes, this was a real legal battle. Yes, it happened in the 2010s. No, you're not dreaming. The Food and Drug Administration has standards of identity for various foods, which means they define exactly what can be called by certain names. Milk, according to the FDA, should contain milk fat. When you remove the milk fat to make skim milk, you've created something that technically doesn't meet the standard definition anymore. Some dairies, trying to improve the nutritional profile, would add vitamins back into skim milk to replace what was lost when the fat was removed. Florida took this very seriously. A dairy farmer wanted to sell skim milk with added vitamins, calling it skim milk. The state said no. If you're adding things that aren't naturally in milk, it's not really milk anymore. It's imitation milk product. You can sell it, but you have to call it what it is: imitation. The farmer sued, arguing this was a First Amendment violation. He wanted to label his product truthfully as skim milk, which it was. The state was forcing him to use a misleading label that would hurt sales. Nobody wants to buy imitation milk product when they could buy skim milk from a competitor in another state. This went to court. There were legal briefs about the definition of milk. Expert witnesses testified about dairy standards. Judges had to consider whether skim milk is milk or an imitation of milk, which is the kind of question that sounds absurd until you're reading the case law. The courts eventually sided with the farmer. You can call skim milk, milk, even if you've added vitamins back to it. The First Amendment protects truthful commercial speech, and forcing someone to label skim milk as imitation. But for a while there, Florida was ready to die on the hill of skim milk nomenclature, defending the definition of milk with the seriousness usually reserved for actual important legal issues. And in fairness, for dairy farmers whose livelihoods depend on dairy sales. But from the outside, watching lawyers argue about whether skim milk is exactly the kind of regulatory absurdity that makes you wonder how we got here. The answer, as always, is slowly, one strange decision at a time. Federal eagle feather possession ban. Let's talk about eagles, specifically about how possessing their feathers is a federal crime punishable by significant fines and jail time, unless you're Native American and have the proper permits for religious or cultural use. This creates one of the stranger intersections of wildlife protection, religious freedom, and federal law enforcement. The Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, passed in 1940, makes it illegal to possess eagle parts, including feathers, without a permit. The law was designed to protect eagles, which were threatened by hunting and habitat loss. Makes sense. Eagles are magnificent birds and national symbols. We should protect them. But eagles have cultural and religious significance for many Native American tribes. Eagle feathers are used in ceremonies, worn in regalia, and are sacred objects in various indigenous traditions. So the law created an exception. Enrolled members of federally recognized tribes can apply for permits to possess eagle feathers for religious purposes. This creates an unusual enforcement situation. If a non-native person picks up an eagle feather they find on a hike and keeps it, that's a federal crime. If they're caught, they face fines up to $100,000 or a year in prison. The same feather in the possession of a Native American, with proper documentation for religious use, is completely legal. There's a federal repository for eagle parts, the National Eagle Repository in Colorado, where dead eagles found by wildlife officials are stored. Native Americans can request feathers for ceremonial use, and the repository will send them. The waiting list is typically years long because demand exceeds supply, even with the eagles dying naturally. This has led to some strange legal cases. People have been prosecuted for picking up feathers they found. Others have faced charges for possessing feathers inherited from relatives who obtained them before the law existed. The government takes eagle protection seriously enough that even well-intentioned possession is a crime. The law reflects competing values: protecting endangered species versus respecting indigenous religious practices versus allowing people to appreciate nature. The solution was to create a system where intent, ancestry, and permits determine legality. It works, mostly, but it means that the same object can be a sacred religious item or criminal contraband depending on who's holding it. And somewhere in Colorado, there's a freezer full of dead eagles waiting to be distributed to tribal members for ceremonies, which is both reverent and deeply strange. No private gold mining on public land. Let's dig into the ground now, literally, and talk about gold mining on public lands, which is governed by one of the oldest and strangest federal laws still in effect, the General Mining Law of 1872. This law is over 150 years old and still shapes how mineral extraction works on federal property. The original law was simple. If you found valuable minerals on public land, you could stake a claim, extract the minerals, and keep the profits. The government charged nothing for this. No royalties, no fees, just free minerals if you could dig them up. The goal was to encourage westward expansion and economic development during the frontier era. That law is still mostly in effect today, though it's been modified over the decades. You can still stake mining claims on public land. You still don't pay royalties on what you extract, unlike with oil and gas leases. But modern environmental regulations have made actually mining those claims much more complicated. Environmental reviews are required. Water quality concerns must be addressed. Wildlife habitat protection comes into play. Cultural and historical site surveys need to happen. By the time you've navigated all the regulations, your mining claim might be economically worthless, or at least economically questionable, depending on gold prices and the cost of compliance. So you end up with billions of dollars worth of claimed mineral rights sitting dormant on public lands. People hold the claims, sometimes for decades, paying small annual fees to maintain them, waiting for either regulations to change or metal prices to rise enough to make extraction worthwhile. It's mineral speculation, essentially, but with 100-year-old laws governing who owns what. There have been attempts to reform the mining law, to address the fact that we're giving away public resources for free, while other industries pay for access. These attempts consistently fail, usually because Western state politicians protect mining interests. So, we're left with this: a Civil War-era law that assumed unlimited resources and zero environmental concerns, layered over with modern regulations that assume the opposite, creating a system where you can legally claim gold but practically can't mine it. Either way, there's gold in them hills, and technically, you could stake a claim if you're willing to deal with paperwork from both 1872 and the modern administrative state simultaneously. Federal, don't tread on me, plate ban. Here's a recent one that caused confusion and controversy: the case of Gadsden flag license plates and whether government entities could ban them as controversial political symbols. The Gadsden flag, you probably know it, features a coiled rattlesnake and the words, "Don't tread on me." It's a Revolutionary War-era symbol that's been adopted by various political movements over the years. In some states, particularly those where federal pressure or guidance influence decisions, there have been cases where the Gadsden flag was deemed too controversial for specialty license plates. The reasoning varied. Some saw it as associated with extremist groups. Others viewed it as politically divisive. Still others worried about its use by certain modern movements. This created an odd situation where a symbol from the American Revolution, featured in history textbooks and museums, was being treated as potentially offensive or inappropriate for government-issued license plates. The same flag that represented the colony's resistance to British rule was now controversial enough that some officials didn't want it on cars. The debate highlighted tensions between historical symbols and their modern appropriations. The Gadsden flag means different things to different people. To some, it's a patriotic symbol of individual liberty and limited government. And in the middle are government officials trying to decide if it's appropriate for license plates. Several legal challenges emerged. Free speech advocates argued that banning historical American symbols from license plates violated First Amendment rights. Others pointed out that license plates are government property, and the government can set reasonable standards for what messages it endorses by allowing on its plates. Some states that initially rejected Gadsden flag plates reversed their decisions after public outcry or legal pressure. Others maintained Restrictions. The federal government didn't mandate a ban, but federal workplace guidelines that questioned the flag's appropriateness in some contexts influenced how states thought about the issue. It's a perfect example of how symbols evolve, how history gets reinterpreted, and how what was uncontroversial in 1775 can become a political statement in the 2010s. The snake that represented colonial unity is now a symbol that divides people based on which modern movement they associate it with. And somewhere, founding fathers are probably confused about how their rattlesnake became controversial, though given their own political divisions, maybe they'd understand better than we think. No commercial use of space photos. In the early days of space exploration, back in the 1960s when humans were first leaving Earth and seeing our planet from above, there was a question nobody had really considered before. Who owns these photographs? Can NASA astronauts take pictures in space and then sell them commercially? Can aerospace companies use space images in advertisements? The initial answer was complicated. NASA photos were generally considered government work products, which meant they were public domain. But there were restrictions on certain images, particularly early astronaut photography that showed sensitive equipment or locations. The military had concerns about what enemy nations might learn from space photos. Then there was the question of commercial exploitation. If an astronaut took a spectacular photo of Earth from orbit, could they sell it to National Geographic? Could companies use NASA images in advertisements without permission? The early rules were strict. No commercial use without authorization. Space photos were for scientific and educational purposes, not profit. This created tension. Astronauts wanted to share the incredible images they captured. Publishers wanted to use them in books and magazines. Companies wanted to use space imagery for advertising, to associate their brands with the excitement and achievement of space exploration. But government regulations said no to most of it. The restrictions loosened over time. By the Apollo program, NASA was actively distributing photos to media. The famous Earthrise photo from Apollo 8 became widely available. Moon landing footage was broadcast worldwide. The government realized that sharing these images benefited the space program by generating public support and excitement. Now, most NASA imagery is freely available for commercial and personal use. You can use photos of Mars rovers, the International Space Station, or distant galaxies in pretty much any way you want. The early restrictions have mostly disappeared, replaced by a policy of openness and public access. But for those first years of space exploration, there was genuine uncertainty about whether humans had the right to commercially distribute images of space, and whether the government should control access to photographs of Earth from orbit. It's a reminder that every new technology, every new capability, creates legal and regulatory questions that previous generations never had to answer. Someone had to decide who owned the first photos from space, and they made different decisions than we might make today. Federal metric conversion mandate. In 1975, the United States Congress passed the Metric Conversion Act, declaring that the metric system was the preferred system of weights and measures for United States trade and commerce, and establishing a board to coordinate the voluntary conversion. This was it. America was finally going metric, joining the rest of the world in using sensible, base 10 measurements instead of our chaotic system of feet, pounds, and gallons. Except it didn't work. At all. The conversion was voluntary, which meant nobody had to actually do it unless they wanted to. Some industries adopted metric measurements. Science and medicine were already using metric. But the general public continued using the measurements they'd always used, because changing required effort and expense, and nobody wanted to mandate it strongly enough to force the issue. There was a brief period in the late 1970s and early 1980s when it looked like metric might take hold. Road signs in some areas were changed to show kilometers alongside miles. Schools taught metric in preparation for the coming conversion. Weather reports started including Celsius temperatures. Then the momentum died. The metric board was disbanded in 1982. Federal funding for conversion efforts dried up. The road signs that had been changed were quietly changed back. America collectively shrugged and decided that feet and inches were fine, actually, and we didn't need to match what every other country was doing. So now we exist in this weird hybrid state. But Americans still measure their height in feet and inches, their weight in pounds, their road distances in miles, their temperature in Fahrenheit. We buy soda in 2-liter bottles, but milk in gallons. We run 5-kilometer races, but measure football fields in yards. The 1975 law technically made metric our preferred system. In practice, we just ignored that preference. It's still on the books. We're still technically committed to metric conversion. We just decided that voluntary meant never and moved on with our lives. Other countries find this baffling. Americans find it normal. And somewhere in federal archives, there's probably still planning documents for the great metric conversion that never happened, gathering dust alongside all the other ambitious federal plans that quietly disappeared when they met the reality of American stubbornness. Here's one that might surprise you. It's effectively illegal to sell horse meat for human consumption in the United States. Not because there's a specific law against eating horses, but because the Department of Agriculture isn't allowed to fund inspections of horse slaughter facilities. No inspections means no legal commercial horse meat. This started in the 2000s, when Congress began including riders in annual agriculture appropriations bills prohibiting the use of federal funds for inspecting horses intended for human consumption. Without USDA inspections, slaughterhouses cannot legally operate. The last horse slaughter plants in the United States closed in 2007. The motivation was animal welfare. Horses occupy a special place in American culture. They're not livestock. They're companions, athletes, working animals. The idea of slaughtering horses for meat disturbed enough people that Congress responded by defunding inspections, effectively shutting down the industry without technically banning it. But horses still get slaughtered. They're just shipped to Canada or Mexico, where horse meat is legal and has a market. So instead of regulating domestic horse slaughter with American standards, we've exported it to other countries where we have no control over the conditions. Animal welfare advocates are divided on whether this actually helps horses or just makes their end worse. There's also the question of what happens to unwanted horses. Keeping horses is expensive. If owners can't sell them for slaughter, some horses end up neglected or abandoned. Rescue organizations are overwhelmed. The market value of horses crashed because the slaughter option disappeared. Meanwhile, horse meat for pet food is still legal. Horses can be slaughtered for dog food or export. It's only the human consumption part that's effectively banned through inspection defunding. So the regulatory distinction is, feeding horses to pets is fine. The inspection ban gets renewed almost every year through budget riders. It's politically easier than passing an actual law banning horse slaughter, which would require more debate and face different legal challenges. So we maintain this system where horse meat is legal in theory but impossible in practice, and everyone pretends this is a coherent policy. Federal, cigarette warning, graphic, rejection. In 2009, Congress gave the Food and Drug Administration authority to regulate tobacco products, including the power to require warning labels on cigarette packages. The FDA, looking at successful graphic warning campaigns in other countries, proposed requiring large, graphic images showing the health consequences of smoking: diseased lungs, cancer patients, corpses, the kind of images that would make you put down that cigarette immediately. They designed 9 different graphic warnings, covering things like lung cancer, heart disease, and smoking during pregnancy. The images were intentionally shocking. That was the point. Countries that implemented graphic warnings saw reductions in smoking rates. The FDA wanted similar results in America. Tobacco companies sued, arguing that forcing them to put graphic images on their products violated the First Amendment. They weren't objecting to warning labels in general. Those had been required since 1965. But compelling them to display specific graphic images was compelled speech, and the government couldn't do that without a really good reason. The case went to federal court. In 2012, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals sided with the tobacco companies, ruling that the graphic warning requirements violated the First Amendment. The government could require factual disclosures about health risks, but it couldn't require emotional, graphic images designed to persuade people not to smoke. That crossed the line from disclosure to advocacy. The FDA withdrew the proposed graphics and never implemented the requirement. American cigarette packs still have text warnings, the same basic warnings that have been there for decades, but no graphic images. Meanwhile, other countries have had graphic warnings for years, showing disturbing photos of smoking's consequences right on the package. It's an interesting First Amendment case. The government can regulate cigarettes heavily, can tax them, can restrict where they're sold and who can buy them, can require health warnings. But compelling tobacco companies to serve as vehicles for anti-smoking advocacy through graphic images apparently goes too far. The line between regulation and compelled speech is narrow, and the courts decided graphic warnings crossed it. So American smokers get text warnings while smokers elsewhere get nightmare fuel on every pack, and First Amendment protections apply even to products that kill their users when used as intended. No raw milk interstate sales. Let's end this section by talking about milk again, because apparently dairy regulation is a recurring theme in American governance. Specifically, let's talk about raw milk, unpasteurized milk, straight from the cow, and how the federal government has banned its interstate sale since 1987 on the grounds that it poses serious health risks. Pasteurization, the process of heating milk to kill harmful bacteria, became standard in the early 20th century after it became clear that contaminated milk was spreading diseases like tuberculosis and typhoid fever. Pasteurized milk is significantly safer than raw milk. This isn't controversial among public health experts. The data is overwhelming. But some people prefer raw milk. They claim it tastes better, has more nutrients, or provides health benefits that pasteurization destroys. Raw milk advocates argue that healthy cows producing milk in clean conditions don't pose significant risks, and that people should have the freedom to choose what they consume. The FDA disagrees strongly. In 1987, they banned the interstate sale of raw milk for human consumption, citing the risk of foodborne illness. You can still buy raw milk in some states where state laws permit it, but you cannot legally transport it across state lines or sell it through interstate commerce. The federal ban applies to mail-order sales, online sales, or any transaction that crosses state boundaries. This has created an underground raw milk economy. People travel across state lines to buy it. Farmers create cow share programs where technically you own part of the cow and are just collecting milk from your own animal, skirting sale regulations. Raw milk enthusiasts treat it like contraband, arranging secret pickup locations and speaking in code about fresh dairy products. The health risks are real. Outbreaks of illness from raw milk happen regularly, but so do illnesses from other foods we allow to be sold. The question is where we draw the line between protecting public health and allowing personal choice, and the federal government drew that line at raw milk. So now we have this situation where raw milk is legal in some states, but federally prohibited from crossing borders, creating a patchwork of regulations that would make the Founding Fathers wonder what exactly we're doing with the Commerce Clause. Federal light bulb efficiency phase out. Speaking of the government deciding what you can and cannot buy for your own home, let's talk about light bulbs. In 2007, Congress passed energy efficiency standards that effectively phased out traditional incandescent bulbs, the kind Thomas Edison would recognize, the kind that had been lighting American homes for over a century. The Energy Independence and Security Act set minimum efficiency standards that most traditional incandescent bulbs couldn't meet. The goal was reducing energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions. Incandescent bulbs convert most of their energy into heat rather than light, which makes them incredibly inefficient. Compact fluorescents and LEDs use a fraction of the energy for the same amount of light. From a purely environmental and economic standpoint, this made sense. LED bulbs last years longer and use 75% less energy. Switching to efficient lighting would save billions in energy costs and reduce power plant emissions. It was good policy backed by solid data, but it was also the government telling people what kind of light bulbs they could buy. And that triggered a surprising backlash. The light bulb freedom movement emerged, with politicians and citizens arguing that the federal government had no business regulating light bulbs. If people wanted inefficient incandescent bulbs that cost more to operate, that was their choice. Freedom meant choosing your own light bulbs, apparently. The phase-out began in 2012, with different wattages banned on different schedules. Manufacturers stopped producing most traditional incandescent bulbs. Stores sold off their remaining stock. And Americans discovered that LED bulbs, despite initial skepticism, actually worked fine. Better, even. They lasted longer, stayed cooler, and reduced electricity bills. There were attempts to repeal the efficiency standards. Bills were introduced. Politicians made speeches about government overreach and light bulb liberty, but the standards mostly held, with some modifications and delays. By 2014, traditional incandescent bulbs were largely gone from store shelves. The irony is that by the time the regulations fully took effect, most people had already switched voluntarily because LEDs had become better and cheaper. But the regulations accelerated the transition and ensured manufacturers invested in efficient lighting technology. So now we all use LED bulbs, barely remember what incandescent bulbs were like, and occasionally wonder why there was such controversy about lighting technology. But for a few years there, light bulbs were a surprisingly divisive political issue, which is exactly the kind of thing that happens when the federal government regulates everyday household items. No bump stock. After 2017, then unbanned. In October of 2017, a shooter in Las Vegas used firearms equipped with bump stocks, devices that allow semi-automatic rifles to fire at rates approaching automatic weapons. The shooting killed 58 people and injured hundreds more. In the aftermath, there was pressure to do something about bump stocks. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives had previously determined that bump stocks didn't convert firearms into machine guns, and therefore weren't regulated under the National Firearms Act. But after Las Vegas, the Trump administration directed the ATF to reconsider. In 2018, the ATF issued a new rule, reclassifying bump stocks as machine guns, effectively banning them. Owners had 90 days to destroy their bump stocks or surrender them to ATF. No compensation was offered. Devices that had been legal to purchase and own suddenly became contraband. Possession became a felony punishable by up to 10 years in prison. It was a regulatory change, not a law passed by Congress, but it had the force of law nonetheless. Gun rights advocates challenged the rule, arguing that the ATF had overstepped its authority. A bump stock doesn't mechanically alter the firing mechanism of a gun. It uses recoil to help the shooter pull the trigger faster, but each shot still requires a separate trigger pull. By definition, that's not a machine gun, which fires multiple rounds with a single trigger function. The case went to the Supreme Court. In 2024, the court ruled in favor of gun owners, finding that bump stocks do not convert rifles into machine guns under the federal definition. The ATF's rule was vacated. Bump stocks became legal again, at least at the federal level. It was a regulatory flip-flop that happened over the course of 6 years. Legal, then banned, then legal again. People who had destroyed their bump stocks in compliance with the ban couldn't get them back. People who had kept them in defiance of the ban were suddenly in compliance again. And the underlying policy question of whether devices that dramatically increase firing rates should be regulated remained unresolved. It's a case study in how regulatory agencies can make and unmake rules based on political pressure and legal interpretations, and how those rules can change dramatically depending on which administration is in power and how courts interpret statutory language. The bump stock saga isn't over. It's just in a different phase, waiting for the next tragedy, or the next legal challenge, or the next political shift to change the rules again. Federal cash reporting, over $10,000. And let's talk about money, specifically about how carrying or depositing large amounts of cash makes you a suspected criminal in the eyes of the federal government. The Bank Secrecy Act, passed in 1970, requires financial institutions to report cash transactions over $10,000 to the government. The goal was fighting money laundering, tax evasion, and organized crime. On the surface, this seems reasonable. Large cash transactions are unusual in modern America, where most people use cards and electronic transfers. If you're depositing $50,000 in cash, maybe the government should check that it's legitimate income and you're paying taxes on it. But the rules get stranger. If you try to avoid the reporting requirement by breaking up a large cash amount into smaller deposits, that's called structuring, and structuring is itself a federal crime. Even if the money is completely legitimate, legally earned, and tax paid, intentionally avoiding the reporting requirement by making multiple smaller deposits is a felony. This has led to cases where people who owned cash-intensive businesses made regular deposits just under $10,000 for convenience or habit and never tried to hide anything, suddenly found themselves under federal investigation. The government could seize their money under civil forfeiture laws without even charging them with a crime, just for the pattern of deposits. The term smurfing was coined for this practice after the cartoon characters who were small and numerous. Make enough small transactions and you're smurfing, and smurfing is illegal, even if every dollar was earned legally. Critics point out that this criminalizes behavior that has innocent explanations. Not everyone who makes cash deposits under $10,000 is laundering money. Some people just don't want the paperwork. Some don't trust banks with large deposits. Some are following advice they received about avoiding unnecessary government scrutiny. But the law doesn't care about intent in many cases. The pattern of deposits itself is evidence of structuring, and once the government suspects structuring, they can seize your money and make you prove it was legitimate, flipping the usual burden of proof. So now we have a situation where having too much cash is suspicious, and trying to avoid suspicion by depositing smaller amounts is even more suspicious, and the safest thing to do is just never deal in large amounts of cash at all, which, cynically, is probably the intended result, pushing everyone toward traceable electronic transactions where the government can monitor everything. It's financial surveillance dressed up as crime prevention, and it works because most people never deal with enough cash to trigger the reporting requirements or know about the structuring prohibition. No, Kinder Egg import. Here's a delightful example of American regulatory overreach. Kinder Eggs, the chocolate eggs with toys inside, that are beloved by children across Europe and much of the world, are illegal to import into the United States. They have been banned since 1938 under a regulation that prohibits embedding non-nutritive objects in food. The concern is choking hazards. Children might not realize there's a toy capsule inside the chocolate, bite into it, and choke on the toy or its small parts. The FDA regulation is quite clear. You cannot sell candy with toys or other non-food items embedded inside it. It's a safety rule designed to protect children. This would be a minor curiosity except for the fines. Customs officials take Kinder Egg smuggling seriously. People have faced fines of thousands of dollars per egg for trying to bring them across the border. Over the years, the total fines levied have exceeded $1 million for chocolate eggs. The absurdity is that Kinder Eggs are legal in dozens of countries without apparent epidemic of choking deaths. European children manage to eat Kinder Eggs without mass casualties. The toy is inside a large plastic capsule that's pretty obviously not food, but American regulations say no. And American customs enforcement backs that up with surprisingly aggressive fines. Ferrero, the company that makes Kinder Eggs, eventually created a modified version for the American market, Kinder Joy. Instead of a chocolate egg with a toy embedded inside, it's a two-chambered container with chocolate in one side and the toy in a separate sealed compartment. This technically complies with FDA regulations because the toy isn't embedded in the food, it's just packaged alongside it. So Americans can have almost Kinder Eggs, but not the real thing. And if you travel abroad and try to bring back actual Kinder Eggs as gifts, customs might confiscate them and fine you hundreds of dollars per egg for attempting to import prohibited confectionery. It's regulatory paranoia, meeting genuine safety concerns, meeting cultural differences about acceptable risk. European regulators think American Kinder Egg prohibition is ridiculous. American regulators think Europeans are cavalier about choking hazards. And in the middle are children who just want chocolate eggs with toys inside. and don't understand why nationality determines whether that's legal. The Great Kinder Egg War continues. One confiscated chocolate egg at a time. Federal peanut butter standard. Let's stay in the food regulation arena and talk about peanut butter, which is not just ground peanuts despite what you might think. The FDA has standards of identity for peanut butter, establishing exactly what can be called by that name. And those standards have been the subject of surprising controversy over the decades. According to FDA regulations established in the 1960s, peanut butter must contain at least 90% peanuts. The remaining 10% can be salt, sweeteners, and stabilizers. But peanuts must be the dominant ingredient. If your product is less than 90% peanuts, you cannot legally call it peanut butter. You have to call it peanut spread or some other designation. This matters to manufacturers because peanut butter sells better than peanut spread. Consumers know what peanut butter is. They trust the name. Changing the label affects sales. So, companies have fought to either meet the 90% standard or change the rules. There have been lawsuits over peanut butter composition. Jif and Skippy, two major brands, have faced legal challenges about their ingredients and whether they meet standards of identity. The battles have involved questions like whether you can add palm oil to improve texture and still call it peanut butter, or whether certain processing methods alter the product enough to require different labeling. The FDA's position has generally been firm: 90% peanuts or you can't use the name. This protects consumers from being deceived by products that are mostly oils and fillers with just enough peanut flavor to seem legitimate. But it also shows how heavily regulated American food is. Most consumers have no idea that there's a specific legal definition of peanut butter enforced by federal regulators. They just buy jars labeled peanut butter and assume it's mostly peanuts, which it is, because the regulations require it. Some natural peanut butter advocates argue the standard should be even stricter, requiring 100% peanuts with no additives at all. Others think the regulations are unnecessary government interference in the market. And in the middle, peanut butter manufacturers carefully calculate their recipes to meet the 90% threshold, while still achieving the smooth texture and long shelf life that consumers expect. It's a small example of how thoroughly the government regulates food composition and labeling, ostensibly to protect consumers, but also creating complex rules that most people never think about when they're making a sandwich. Somewhere, FDA officials are probably debating whether some new ingredient is acceptable in the 10% non-peanut portion, maintaining standards that have existed since the Johnson administration. No flavored cigarette ban except menthol. In 2009, Congress passed the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act, giving the FDA authority to regulate tobacco products. One provision banned flavored cigarettes, chocolate, vanilla, fruit flavors, any cigarette that tasted like anything other than tobacco. The reasoning was that flavored cigarettes appealed to young people and encouraged smoking initiation. There was one glaring exception: menthol. Menthol cigarettes were specifically exempted from the ban. Congress directed the FDA to study menthol, but didn't prohibit it alongside other flavors. So you couldn't buy a strawberry-flavored cigarette, but menthol remained perfectly legal. This created obvious questions about the real motivation behind the ban. If the concern was flavors that appealed to youth, why was menthol exempt? The answer, critics pointed out, was politics and money. The tobacco industry lobbied hard to protect menthol, which represented a huge portion of the cigarette market. Menthol cigarettes were particularly popular among African American smokers, making any ban politically complicated. Public health advocates were frustrated. Menthol isn't just a flavor, it's a cooling agent that makes cigarettes easier to smoke, particularly for new smokers who find regular cigarettes harsh. By almost any measure, menthol cigarettes pose the same youth appeal concerns as other flavored cigarettes. But menthol had powerful protections that other flavors didn't. There's also a racial dimension that makes this particularly troubling. Menthol cigarettes have been aggressively marketed to Black communities for decades. Smoking-related diseases disproportionately affect African Americans. A menthol ban would disproportionately affect Black smokers, but continuing to allow menthol also disproportionately harms Black communities. It's a policy decision with no easy answers and significant racial equity implications. The FDA has since proposed banning menthol, but as of now, it remains legal while other flavored cigarettes are not. The proposed rule has faced delays, legal challenges, and political pressure. Actually implementing a menthol ban is complicated by the size of the market and concerns about creating a black market, so we're left with this: a flavored cigarette ban that exempts the most popular and, arguably, most harmful flavor, based on political calculations that valued industry lobbying and electoral concerns over consistent public health policy. It's a perfect example of how halfway measures in regulation can actually highlight the problems they're supposedly solving, and how good intentions in Congress can be undermined by the realities of politics and lobbying. Federal catfish inspection transfer. In 2014, something wonderfully petty happened. Congress moved responsibility for inspecting catfish from the Food and Drug Administration to the Department of Agriculture. This change, tucked into the Farm Bill, a similar fish that was being imported and sold as catfish. The reasoning given was food safety. USDA inspections are supposedly more rigorous than FDA inspections, so American consumers would be safer with USDA-inspected catfish. But the real motivation was creating regulatory barriers for imported fish. USDA inspection requirements are more extensive and expensive than FDA requirements. Foreign producers would have to meet higher standards, making it harder and more costly to export to the United States. The switch cost about $20 million to implement. The USDA had to build an entirely new catfish inspection program. Staff had to be hired and trained. Facilities had to be established. All of this for a fish that was already being safely inspected by the FDA under existing protocols. Food safety experts couldn't identify any actual problem that the switch would solve. This became a minor scandal in agricultural policy circles. International trade partners complained that it was protectionism disguised as food safety regulation. The World Trade Organization questioned whether it violated trade agreements. But the catfish farmers got what they wanted: regulatory protection from competition. Vietnamese bassa producers faced higher costs and barriers to entry. American catfish farmers maintained their market share, and consumers paid more for fish because imported alternatives were harder to get. It's a textbook example of how special interest groups use regulatory complexity to protect themselves from competition. You don't ask for tariffs or quotas, which are obvious protectionism. You ask for different inspection regimes, food safety standards, labeling requirements. The catfish inspection program remains in place, a $20 million solution to a problem that didn't exist, benefiting a small number of catfish farmers at the expense of consumers and taxpayers. Somewhere, someone is very proud of this legislative achievement, and that's American agricultural policy. Deeply strange, occasionally corrupt, and defended with completely straight faces by the people who benefit from it. No, cell phone unlocking without carrier. In 2012, something strange happened to cell phone ownership. The Librarian of Congress, who periodically reviews exemptions to the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, allowed an exemption for cell phone unlocking to expire. Suddenly, unlocking your phone to use it on a different carrier became technically illegal. This sounds absurd because it is. You bought a phone, you own it. But under DMCA anti-circumvention provisions, breaking the carrier lock on that phone was classified as circumventing a technological protection measure, which is illegal even if you're doing it to a device you own. The practical effect was that if you wanted to switch carriers, you had to ask your current carrier's permission to unlock the phone. They could say no, they could charge fees. They could refuse to unlock until your contract was complete. Your own device was held hostage by carrier policies and federal copyright law. Public backlash was immediate. Over 100,000 people signed a White House petition asking for the ban to be overturned. The message was simple: you should own your phone. If you paid for it, you should be able to use it on whatever network you choose. Carrier locks are anti-competitive and anti-consumer. In 2014, Congress passed the Unlocking Consumer Choice and Wireless Competition Act, making phone unlocking legal again. The Own Your Phone campaign had won. Consumers could unlock their devices without committing a federal crime, but the fact that it happened at all is instructive. Copyright law was being used to enforce carrier business models. Federal regulations were protecting corporate interests over consumer rights. It took a public campaign and congressional action to fix what should never have been a problem in the first place. The cell phone unlocking saga is a reminder of how technological change creates regulatory confusion, and how that confusion can be exploited by companies to restrict consumer rights. It's also a reminder that sometimes, when enough people complain loudly enough, the government actually fixes obviously broken rules. So now you can unlock your phone. You own it, at least in the sense that you can choose which network to use it on. It's a small victory for consumer rights and common sense, one only because people recognized how absurd the restriction was and made enough noise to change it. Federal shark fin ban. In 2010, Congress passed the Shark Conservation Act, which among other provisions prohibited a practice called shark finning, catching sharks, cutting off their fins, and throwing the still living sharks back into the ocean to die. It's exactly as brutal as it sounds, and it was driven by demand for shark fin soup, a delicacy in some Asian cuisines. The fins are valuable. The rest of the shark is less profitable. So fishing operations would catch sharks, take only the fins, and discard the bodies to save space on the boat for more fins. This practice was decimating shark populations worldwide. Sharks reproduce slowly, and industrial-scale finning was killing them faster than they could recover. The U.S. ban made it illegal to remove shark fins at sea. If you catch a shark, you have to bring the entire shark to shore. You can't just take the fins and discard the body. The goal was both conservation and preventing waste. Sharks are important apex predators in ocean ecosystems. Their decline has cascading effects on marine environments. Enforcement has been challenging. International waters complicate jurisdiction. Demand for shark fins continues in global markets. Some fishing operations move to countries with weaker regulations, but the U.S. ban at least prevented American waters and American fishing vessels from participating in the practice. There's cultural sensitivity around shark fin soup. For some communities, it's a traditional dish served at weddings and important occasions. The conservation community has worked to find alternatives and change perceptions without dismissing cultural significance. It's a complicated balance between respecting traditions and preventing ecological disaster. The fin ban is one of several federal protections for sharks, which despite their fearsome reputation are actually vulnerable to overfishing and habitat loss. Americans think of sharks as dangerous predators, but they're far more threatened by us than we are by them. Shark attacks kill about one person per year in the U.S. We kill millions of sharks annually, so now shark finning is illegal in American waters. The fins that do make it to market are supposed to come from sharks that were fully utilized, and conservation groups continue working to reduce global demand for fins while protecting shark populations from collapse. No horseshoe crab blood restrictions. Let's end this section with something genuinely bizarre. Horseshoe crabs have blue blood that's worth about $60,000 per quart, and we harvest it for medical purposes. This is legal, regulated, and essential for ensuring the safety of many medical devices and vaccines. It's also deeply strange. Horseshoe crab blood contains a substance called limulus amoebocyte lysate, or LAL, which reacts to bacterial endotoxins. This makes it incredibly useful for testing whether medical equipment and injectable drugs are contaminated. Before LAL testing, there wasn't a reliable way to detect certain types of bacterial contamination. The horseshoe crab blood test revolutionized medical safety. So we catch horseshoe crabs, extract about 30% of their blood, and release them back into the water. Most survive. The companies that do this are regulated and monitored. The crabs are handled carefully. The process is designed to minimize harm. But it's still fundamentally weird. We're harvesting the blood of ancient arthropods that have existed largely unchanged for 450 million years, because their immune systems happen to have a property useful to modern medicine. Horseshoe crabs predated the dinosaurs and now serve as living factories for medical testing reagents. Conservation concerns exist. Horseshoe crabs are also harvested for bait in some fisheries. Their eggs are an important food source for migratory birds. There are questions about whether current harvest levels are sustainable. Scientists are developing synthetic alternatives to LAL, but the natural product remains the gold standard for endotoxin testing. Federal and state regulations govern horseshoe crab harvesting, including limits on how many can be taken and requirements for releasing them after bleeding. It's managed somewhat sustainably, though environmental groups worry about declining populations in some areas. The crab's medical value has actually provided some protection by making their conservation economically important, so the next time you get a vaccine or use a medical device, spare a thought for the horseshoe crabs, whose blue blood helped ensure it was safe. They're out there in the ocean, ancient and blue-blooded. Federal wine shipping state patchwork. Speaking of regulations that vary wildly depending on where you happen to be standing, let's talk about wine shipping. In 2005, the Supreme Court ruled in Granholm v. Heald that states couldn't allow in-state wineries to ship directly to consumers while prohibiting out-of-state wineries from doing the same. That was unconstitutional discrimination against interstate commerce. You'd think this would have opened up wine shipping nationwide. Instead, it created a patchwork of state regulations that range from permissive to Byzantine. Some states allow direct shipping from any licensed winery. Others require special permits. Some prohibit it entirely. And the restrictions change regularly as states adjust their laws. The beneficiaries of this complexity are distributors, the middlemen between wineries and retailers. Before direct shipping, distributors controlled access to markets. If a small winery wanted to sell in another state, they had to go through distributors who took substantial cuts. Direct shipping threatened that business model. So, distributors lobbied state legislatures to maintain restrictions even after Granholm. They argued about tax collection, underage drinking prevention, and regulatory oversight. The real concern was losing their monopoly on wine distribution. States listened because distributors are politically connected, and wineries are often small businesses without lobbying power. This matters to consumers. If you visit a winery in California and want them to ship wine to your home in another state, whether that's legal depends on a complex web of state regulations. Some wineries can't afford to navigate 50 different state shipping laws, so they simply don't ship at all. Consumers lose access to wines they can't buy locally. The wine wars continue in state legislatures and courts. Each year brings new battles between wineries seeking market access and distributors protecting their territory. Sometimes, wineries win expansions of shipping rights. Sometimes distributors successfully defend restrictions, and consumers remain confused about what's legal and what's not. It's a perfect example of how federalism creates regulatory complexity, and how that complexity serves established interests over innovation and consumer choice. The Supreme Court said states couldn't discriminate. States responded by creating labyrinthine rules that technically don't discriminate but still make direct shipping difficult enough to protect distributor profits. No. Genetically engineered salmon label delay. In 2015, after years of review, the FDA approved AquAdvantage salmon, a genetically engineered Atlantic salmon that grows twice as fast as conventional salmon. It was the first genetically modified animal approved for human consumption in the United States. The science showed it was safe. Environmental safeguards were in place. Production could begin. Except it couldn't, really. Because while the FDA approved the salmon, they delayed approving labeling guidelines. And then Congress got involved with import bans until labeling requirements were established. And then there were legal challenges from environmental groups. The approval process had taken 20 years. The post-approval delays lasted another 5. The Frankenfish debate, as opponents called it, touched on deep anxieties about genetic engineering, corporate control of food, and environmental risks. AquaBounty, the company developing the salmon, argued they'd created a sustainable solution to overfishing. The salmon were sterile females, raised in land-based tanks. They couldn't reproduce in the wild, They required fewer resources to grow. Opponents worried about ecological risks if the salmon escaped, corporate control of genetics, and consumer acceptance of genetically modified fish. They demanded mandatory labeling so consumers could choose whether to buy it. The debate became proxy war between pro-GMO and anti-GMO factions. The labeling fight was particularly contentious. The FDA doesn't require labels for most genetically modified foods because genetic modification itself doesn't make food unsafe or materially different. But opponents wanted specific, genetically engineered labels on salmon, arguing consumers had a right to know. The salmon finally reached markets in limited quantities around 2020. AquaBounty struggled financially. It's a case study in how the regulatory process can work technically while failing practically. The FDA did extensive safety review. They approved based on science. But the combination of slow government processes, political interference, and public skepticism turned a potential innovation into a commercial failure. The first genetically engineered animal approved for consumption became a cautionary tale about what happens when cutting-edge food technology meets regulatory complexity and public fear. Federal baby formula monopoly issues. In February of 2022, the FDA shut down an Abbott nutrition plant in Sturgis, Michigan, after bacterial contamination was found. This plant produced a large portion of America's baby formula supply. Within weeks, store shelves were empty. Parents panicked. The baby formula shortage became a national crisis. How did one plant closure create nationwide shortages? The answer reveals a market with very high concentration and significant regulatory barriers. 3 companies control about 90% of the U.S. baby formula market. Abbott alone had roughly 43%. When their largest plant closed, the market couldn't adjust quickly enough. Import restrictions made the problem worse. The U.S. has strict labeling and nutritional requirements for infant formula. Many foreign formulas don't meet these standards, not because they're unsafe, but because they're formulated for different regulatory environments. So even though baby formula was available in Canada and Europe, it couldn't easily be imported and sold in the U.S. The FDA had to issue emergency authorizations to allow foreign formula imports. Military planes flew formula from Europe. The Defense Production Act was invoked to prioritize formula production. These were emergency measures for what was essentially a regulatory failure that created market vulnerability. Parents who could afford it bought formula online from other countries, hoping it was safe. Those who couldn't faced truly desperate situations, trying to stretch formula, considering unsafe homemade alternatives, or searching store after store for any available product. Having a baby during the shortage was genuinely frightening for many families. The crisis exposed how regulatory protectionism, even well-intentioned rules about infant safety, can create fragility. The barriers that supposedly protected American babies from substandard formula also prevented access to perfectly safe international products during an emergency. Eventually, production recovered. The Abbott plant reopened. Imports helped fill gaps, but the vulnerability remains. The market is still highly concentrated. Import barriers still exist. Another plant closure could trigger another crisis, and parents remember the panic of not being able to feed their babies. No. Plastic microbead. In cosmetics. In 2015, Congress did something relatively unusual. They banned a specific ingredient from cosmetics and personal care products before it became a massive problem. The Microbead Free Waters Act prohibited the use of plastic microbeads in rinse-off cosmetics like facial scrubs, body washes, and toothpaste. Microbeads are tiny plastic particles, usually made of polyethylene, added to products for exfoliation. They felt nice, they worked well, and they were flowing into water systems by the millions. These tiny plastic particles passed through wastewater treatment plants because they were too small to be filtered out. They accumulated in rivers, lakes, and oceans. Fish ate them. Birds ate the fish. The plastics moved up the food chain, concentrating toxic chemicals as they went. Researchers found microplastics in fish, in drinking water, eventually in human bodies. The environmental damage from something as mundane as face wash was becoming clear. The beauty industry initially resisted bans, then saw which way the wind was blowing and began reformulating. By the time the federal law took effect in 2017, many companies had already switched to natural alternatives like ground walnut shells, salt, or sugar for exfoliation. The microbead ban was relatively uncontroversial. Environmental groups supported it. Even many industry representatives didn't fight too hard once they realized natural alternatives worked fine. Consumers didn't notice much difference in their products. The microbeads were replaced, and life went on. It's one of the few feel-good stories in environmental regulation. A problem was identified, addressed relatively quickly, and solved without massive economic disruption or political warfare. The ban didn't fix ocean plastic pollution, which remains a huge problem, but it eliminated one source that was entirely unnecessary. So next time you use facial scrub and it contains ground apricot seeds instead of plastic, thank the 2015 Congress for that small environmental victory. It's nice when regulations work as intended, solve real problems, and don't create chaos in the process. Federal horse slaughter funding ban. We talked earlier about horse meat being effectively illegal for human consumption. Let's revisit that and go deeper into how it actually works, because the mechanism is fascinatingly indirect. There's no law that says you cannot slaughter horses for meat. Instead, Congress has been defunding USDA inspections of horse slaughter facilities through annual appropriations riders since the mid-2000s. This funding ban means that while horse slaughter isn't technically illegal, it's commercially impossible. You cannot legally operate a slaughterhouse without USDA inspection. If Congress won't fund horse meat inspections, you can't get your facility inspected, which means you can't legally operate. It's regulation through defunding. The last domestic horse slaughter plants closed in 2007 when the ban took effect. They're shipped to Mexico and Canada, where horse meat is legal and regulated. Tens of thousands of American horses are exported for slaughter every year. This creates an ethical paradox. The funding ban was supposed to protect horses from slaughter. Instead, it exported the practice to countries where U.S. animal welfare regulations don't apply, and conditions might be worse. Horses undergo longer transport. Slaughter methods may be different. American oversight is impossible. Supporters of the ban argue that any horse slaughter is wrong, that horses are companions, not livestock, and that location doesn't matter. Opponents argue that if slaughter is going to happen anyway, it should happen domestically under American regulations where conditions can be monitored and enforced. There's also the question of what happens to unwanted horses. Keeping horses is expensive. If owners can't sell them for slaughter, neglect and abandonment increase. Horse rescue organizations are overwhelmed. Some horses suffer longer because owners can't afford care but also can't humanely dispose of them. The funding ban gets renewed almost every year, usually without much debate. It's politically easier than tackling the underlying question of whether horse slaughter should be legal. So we continue this system where horse slaughter is legal in theory, impossible in practice domestically, and outsourced internationally. No, clock change debate. Twice a year, Americans participate in a ritual that seems designed specifically to annoy everyone. Changing clocks for daylight saving time. We spring forward, losing an hour of sleep. We fall back, gaining it back. And every single time, people complain and ask why we're still doing this. There have been numerous attempts to end the clock changes. The Sunshine Protection Act, which would make daylight saving time permanent year-round, has been proposed repeatedly. In March of 2022, it actually passed the Senate unanimously. Unanimously. When does the Senate agree on anything unanimously? This seemed like it might finally happen. Then it stalled in the House. It never got a vote. The bill died. And we continue changing our clocks twice a year like we have since the 1960s, when daylight saving time became standardized across most of the country. The arguments for permanent daylight saving time are compelling. It would reduce car accidents, save energy, give people more evening daylight for outdoor activities, and eliminate the disruption of changing clocks. Studies show the clock changes correlate with increased heart attacks, workplace injuries, and general misery. The arguments against are also real. Morning darkness would be worse in winter, particularly affecting children going to school. Some states would have extremely late sunrises. There are agricultural concerns and questions about whether energy savings are actually significant in modern times with different usage patterns than the 1970s. But the real barrier seems to be inertia. Changing this requires Congress to act, and Congress has many other priorities. The states can't do it individually because federal law controls time zones and daylight saving time rules. It requires federal coordination. So every year, proposals emerge. Every year, people complain. And every year, nothing changes. We keep doing the clock change dance, annoying everyone twice annually, because stopping requires someone in Congress to care enough to push it through when there are always more pressing issues. It's government dysfunction in miniature. Everyone agrees the current system is bad. A solution exists. But actually implementing that solution requires overcoming legislative inertia, and that's apparently too difficult. Federal coin design 50 state quarters. In 1999, the U.S. Mint launched the 50 state quarters program, releasing quarters with unique reverse designs representing each state. For 10 years, 5 new quarter designs appeared annually. It was phenomenally successful, creating a collecting craze that got ordinary Americans excited about pocket change. The program generated billions in revenue for the government, not from selling the quarters, but from people collecting them and removing them from circulation. Every quarter sitting in someone's collection instead of being spent was essentially an interest-free loan to the government. Millions of Americans had jars and folders full of quarters they'd never spend, representing real money the government could count as profit. The designs themselves were chosen through state-level processes. Governors submitted concepts. Citizens voted on favorites in some states. The mint produced them in enormous quantities. At the program's peak, billions of state quarters were circulating, and millions of people were checking their change for states they hadn't collected yet. It sounds trivial, but it was genuinely successful as both a revenue generator and a public engagement tool. People who'd never thought about coin collecting became amateur numismatists. Children learned geography and state symbols. Families bonded over completing collections. The success led to follow-up programs, territorial quarters, national park quarters, innovation dollars. The Mint learned that varying coin designs drives collecting behavior, and collecting behavior generates revenue. It's remarkable that something as simple as putting different pictures on quarters created a billion-dollar program. There's something charmingly wholesome about this. The government changed coin designs. People got excited and started collecting them, and everyone benefited. The government made money. People had a fun, accessible hobby. The state quarters program is probably the most universally positive government initiative of the early 2000s. No scandals, no controversies, just quarters with different pictures that made people happy. Sometimes government programs work exactly as intended and make things slightly better without downsides. This was one of those times. No postal banking revival attempts. In the early 20th century, from 1911 to 1967, the United States Postal Service operated a postal savings system. Americans could deposit money at post offices, earn interest, and access basic banking services. It was particularly important for immigrants and rural Americans who didn't have access to traditional banks or didn't trust them after repeated bank failures. The system was successful. At its peak, it held over $3 billion in deposits. It provided secure banking when commercial banks were failing during the Depression. It served communities that commercial banks ignored as unprofitable. Then it was phased out. Banking became more accessible. FDIC insurance made commercial banks safer. The postal banking system seemed unnecessary and was eventually discontinued in 1967. Now, decades later, there's renewed interest in postal banking. Millions of Americans are unbanked or underbanked, meaning they don't have bank accounts or rely on expensive check cashing services and payday lenders. Post offices exist in communities that banks have abandoned. The infrastructure is already there. Proposals to revive postal banking face intense lobbying opposition from commercial banks and payday lending companies. Banks don't want government competition for basic banking services. Payday lenders make enormous profits from the unbanked population and don't want to lose that market. The arguments against postal banking focus on government efficiency concerns and fair competition questions. Should the government compete with private banking? Would postal banking be profitable? Would it require taxpayer subsidies? Proponents point to other countries where postal banking works well, providing affordable financial services to underserved populations. They argue that banking is infrastructure, and government has a role in ensuring everyone has access to basic financial services. The proposals keep failing. Despite occasional legislative interest, postal banking revival never gets enough support to pass. The banking lobby is too strong, the political will too weak, and the status quo too entrenched. So Americans continue paying high fees for basic financial services, and post offices continue being just places to mail packages. Federal national motto on currency. "In God We Trust" appears on American currency. But it wasn't always there, and how it got there is a story about Cold War politics and religious anxiety in mid-century America. The phrase first appeared on coins during the Civil War, added to 2-cent pieces in 1864. But it wasn't on all coins, and it wasn't on paper currency at all, for most of American history. For over a century, our money existed without any reference to God. In 1956, during the Cold War and amid fears about godless communism, Congress passed a law making "In God We Trust" the official national motto, replacing the traditional unofficial motto "E pluribus unum," meaning "out of many one." Within a few years, the motto was required on all currency. The motivation was explicitly religious and political. Distinguishing America from the officially atheist Soviet Union was important to Cold War ideology. America was a religious nation, God-fearing, morally superior to communist atheism. The motto on money was a daily reminder of that distinction. There have been legal challenges. Opponents argue it violates separation of church and state, that government shouldn't endorse religious belief, that it alienates non-religious Americans and religious minorities whose conception of God differs from the Christian God implied by the motto. Courts have consistently ruled that "In God We Trust" is ceremonial deism, a phrase so generic and traditional that it doesn't constitute government establishment of religion. But walk around with that reasoning for a moment. Our national motto is religious, but courts say it's so watered down and ceremonial that it doesn't really mean anything religious, so it's constitutional. It's a strange compromise where the motto is important enough to keep but meaningless enough to be legal. For many Americans, the motto is simply part of the currency, barely noticed. For others, it's a meaningful expression of national faith, and for others still, it's a daily reminder that government officially endorses religious belief. What we've lost in the process is "E pluribus unum," a motto that emphasized unity and pluralism without religious content, replaced by one that asserts religious faith as a defining national characteristic. That change happened 70 years ago, in response to specific Cold War anxieties, and we've never reconsidered it. No Federal Reserve note redesign delays. In 2016, the Treasury Department announced that Harriet Tubman would replace Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill. It was a historic decision, the first woman on regularly circulating U.S. paper currency in over a century, and specifically a formerly enslaved woman who became a conductor on the Underground Railroad and a Union spy. Then, nothing happened. The redesign was repeatedly delayed. Officials cited technical challenges, security features, production timelines, but the delays coincided with political changes. The Trump administration showed little enthusiasm for the change. The timeline kept slipping. In 2021, the Biden administration recommitted to the redesign, but implementation remained years away. The new target was 2030. That's 24 years after the initial announcement. For perspective, during World War II, the entire Manhattan Project took less time than redesigning a $20 bill. The delays reveal how much discretion Treasury secretaries have over currency design. There's no law requiring the Jackson 20 or prohibiting the Tubman 20. It's an executive decision, subject to political winds and bureaucratic priorities. Changing currency design requires coordination between Treasury, the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, and the Federal Reserve. But mostly, it requires someone in authority caring enough to push it through. Anti-counterfeiting features justify some delay. Modern currency requires sophisticated security measures that take years to develop, but the length of the delay suggests other factors beyond technical challenges. Meanwhile, Jackson remains on the 20, a president who signed the Indian Removal Act and owned enslaved people, representing America on one of our most common bills. And Tubman waits, her promised recognition indefinitely postponed. It's a reminder that representation matters, but changing symbols requires more than announcements. It requires sustained commitment, bureaucratic follow-through, and political will that survives changes in administration. Currency redesigns shouldn't be controversial, but apparently everything is controversial if you wait long enough and change administrations. So, we'll see, eventually, whether Harriet Tubman makes it onto the 20, or whether this becomes another case of announced government action that quietly disappears into the maze of bureaucratic delays and political shifts until everyone forgets it was supposed to happen. And there we are. 50 rules that seemed reasonable to someone, somewhere, at some point in American history. From poisoned prohibition alcohol that killed 10,000 people, to Kinder eggs that might cost you thousands in fines. From 1 billion pounds of cheese in caves, to horseshoe crabs whose blue blood saves lives. From mailing children for 15 cents, to requiring duck stamps for hunters. Some of these rules protected us. Some harmed us. Most just left us scratching our heads, wondering what exactly our government was thinking. But they all happened. They're all real. And somewhere right now, someone in Washington is probably drafting another strange rule that future generations will puzzle over. So which rule shocked you most? Poisoned alcohol? Mailed children? Banned butter? Drop a comment below and subscribe for more bizarre history that proves truth really is stranger than fiction. Sleep well. Dream of cheese, caves, and duck stamps. Good night.